Missing someone. Missing someone. Missing someone. Love with all your heart. Missing someone.
Let's talk about Jeff the Killer. By the way, this is a creepypasta. He was a 13-year-old boy who had just moved to a new town with his mother and father. And he was already being bullied a lot in horrible ways that I can't even say on this video. One day at a party, the bullying got a little too out of hand. They disfigured him, lighting him on fire and throwing bleach on his face. He woke up in the hospital with his head wrapped in bandages. His eyelids were burnt off. When he took off the bandages, he noticed his face was all leathery and pale. He started laughing uncontrollably, and doctors just played it off as, oh, maybe it's the medicine we gave him, making him a little loopy. He started saying he loved his new face, and he eventually carved a permanent smile in his mouth because mentally he was broken. He was no longer that nice little 13-year-old boy. That's when he decided to get revenge on the bullies, taking them out one by one.
301, turn over and pray that they think you're asleep. Every night for the past month, I would wake up and the clock would read 301. But it's not just my old alarm clock, it's even my phone and my oven clock. Every single time. The first time it happened, it reminded me of an old story my grandfather used to tell me. He always said, if the clock stops at 301, turn over and pray that they think you're asleep. But my grandfather had a lot of stories, things that he had picked up from the old country, where folklore and stories had a firm grip on everyone's minds. But last week, something changed. I was up late one night reading when the clock struck 301, and all of the clocks froze. The silence was deafening. It felt like the world had stopped breathing. And that's when I heard soft footsteps began to approach my room. The door creaked open, and standing in the doorway was my own family. My mom, dad, and younger brother. They were standing there unnaturally stiff. It was so dark that I couldn't see their faces. The worst part was that they were all whispering, but I couldn't quite make out what they were saying. Then something even more terrifying happened. They all in unison turned their heads to look at me. Their eyes were all glowing a faint blue. I felt like I couldn't breathe. I closed my eyes and started to recite every prayer I could think of. A few moments passed and the whispers stopped. I heard them leave. I didn't dare to move until I heard the clock tick to 3:02. The next morning, I went to confront my family. Why were you in my room last night? They looked at me like I was crazy, and my brother even laughed at me. They said that they didn't do anything and I probably had just had a nightmare, and I probably would have believed them if it hadn't happened every night since. If you wake up and the clock reads 3:01, turn over and pray that they think you're asleep. The last thing I told you is that I went and confronted my family. So if you missed part 1, go back and watch that. Every night since, the ritual had repeated. The clock would stop and the whispers would start. My family would just stare at me with their creepy blue eyes. I finally decided enough was enough. I was gonna confront my grandfather. I needed answers and I needed to know how to make this stop. When I asked him, he looked at me with his eyes filled with sorrow. He said the only way to end it is to stay awake through it. But be forewarned, once you hear their whispers clearly, there is no going back. But I knew what I had to do because I could not endure another night of this torment. So that evening, I drank a cup of coffee and prepared for the night. When the time came, their whispers began. I focused all of my energy trying to decipher their words. We are here to protect, not harm. Do not fear us, but what follows after 3:02. Suddenly, everything clicked. My family wasn't the threat. They were the guardians. The real threat was something I hadn't encountered yet, but I had just invited it into my life. And now every night at 3:02, a new shadow lurks in the darkness. Maybe I should have just listened to my grandpa when he said,
"This is how we learned how long a head can survive without a body." At this time, the guillotine was a really popular way of punishment in France. And in 1905, a French doctor, I'm so sorry if I butcher this, Dr. Beauriot, wanted to figure out just how long a head could survive once it was... So this doctor decided that he was going to go to the next public execution and he was going to try an experiment. And that day, a man by the name of Henry Languille was set for execution. Again, I am so sorry if I don't pronounce any of these names right. Please feel free to correct me in the comments. And the doctor sat front row and center to try out his experiment. After it happened, the doctor began to take notes on what was happening to Henry. At first, the doctor noticed that Henry's eyelids were kind of fluttering, but that wasn't enough. He waited a couple of moments, and then when the eyes weren't fluttering anymore, he proceeded with the next phase. The doctor called out Henry's name and noticed that as soon as he did, the eyelids lifted a little bit and he looked right at him. Not only did Henry's eyes look up at him, but his pupils actually ended up focusing, and the doctor knew that he was looking directly at him. He said that when he looked into Henry's eyes, he was not looking at a dull expression, but of someone who was still living. But after a few seconds, the eyelids closed. So the doctor called Henry's name again, and once more, the eyelids opened, and he looked right at him. The doctor was convinced that he was looking at a living person. But finally, the eyelids closed for a second time, and when the doctor yelled his name for a third time, there was no response. The doctor noted the time, and he saw that the experiment had lasted for a total of 30 seconds. And that is why we know just how long a human head can survive without a body.